America, bonjour, hi, Canada. Hugh is still staying at base camp along the Canadian border. And I will tell you this, they are not coming over in droves. I've decided to take on my duty as a citizen and patrol the northern border this year, but they're not a problem yet. Nothing that I can see. In fact, I don't even have any power yet. Ed Morrissey, however, is in Texas. He might be able to bring you up to speed on the southern border, and I believe he has power this morning. Ed, I appreciate your filling in for me. I believe I'll be up and at work tomorrow, but thank you for filling in.
Well, you're welcome, Hugh. I am live here from the ReliefFactor.com studios in Texas. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com and happy to fill in for Hugh today. We do have power, and we actually have heat. We actually have quite a bit of heat, but we've got all sorts of things here in Texas, and we've got a full show for everybody today. And, of course, one of the big issues, we're going to be discussing a whole bunch of different issues. We're going to be talking about energy later in the hour. We're also going to be talking about energy with American Petroleum Institute President and CEO Mike Summers. That'll come in hour 3. But we've got a lot to talk about gas prices. But first, before we go there, I want to talk a little bit about what today is, because today is one of the few remaining decision days at the Supreme Court. And, of course, we're waiting on two major rulings. One, of course, being Dobbs regarding the Mississippi law on abortion, and the other is the Bruen case in New York regarding the right to bear arms in the state of New York and how that applies. Neither one of those decisions have been handed down yet. We are waiting with bated breath on both of these, but of course most people are focused on the Dobbs decision, not just because it's an abortion decision, not just because it may be the abortion decision where the Supreme Court finally disconnects itself from the abortion debate and hands it back to legislatures, which is where it should have been all along, of course, but also because of all of the death threats that have been going on, all of the protests, which are still going on in front of the homes of Supreme Court justices, which is, by the way, illegal. It's against the law to do that. It is a felony. Congress passed this many years ago. It is a felony to demonstrate in front of any federal judge's house or their personal offices while they are deliberating on a case. And it doesn't take a lot of thought to understand why. By the way, if you're looking for the reference, it's 18 U.S. Code 1507. It's a felony, and it doesn't take a lot of reasoning to figure out why it's illegal. It's because judges aren't supposed to be basing their decisions on public opinion. They're supposed to be basing their decisions on the law, and in the course of the case of the Supreme Court, the law and the Constitution. And that's it. So public protests in front of their houses is basically an intimidation tactic that is intended to force the justices to bow to public pressure rather than do their jobs as their offices are constituted. So that's the reason why we passed 18 U.S.C. 1507. This is passed by Congress. It was signed by a president, and it has been enforced by apparently no one. And the reason why I bring this up is because we've all been just going on the assumption that even though we have had decision days, and they actually cleared a lot of the cases last week. They cleared 11 of the cases on the backlog last week. There are 18 remaining, and I think that there's at least 4 decision days left. Now, I mentioned yesterday that I thought yesterday was one of them, but of course it was Juneteenth yesterday, which is a federal holiday, so they weren't working. So my apologies for that. But the decision day, rather than being on a Monday, this week it's on Tuesday. So I think it's Tuesday and Thursday this week, and Monday and Thursday next week, and then next week is the end of the session. Now, the court will add decision days if they need to add more to get some of these decisions out. And I don't think that they could probably do it on the schedule that they've got right now, but it's not unusual to add days. So we might see a couple of days added this week, a couple of days added next week. It could even run into the first week of July, but after this session and after all of the drama that's happening in front of their homes, people, I don't think these justices want to stick around in Washington, D.C. any longer than they absolutely have to. And I've been joking around for a while that they're going to release the Dobbs decision about 1 hour before they all board airplanes to fly any place else other than Washington, D.C. And so not to expect it until the very end. And I think that's still probably your best bet. Is that it's not going to come out today. It's not going to come out Thursday. It probably come out last. That and Bruen will probably be the two that come out last, probably because also they're likely to have been the most heavily argued internally between the justices. And so it takes longer when that happens for them to write the majority opinion, write the dissents for the dissenters and the majority to see each other's arguments and then to incorporate those into the final drafts of their opinions and so on. It's a long process, and it's a complicated process. And so that's the reason why these things take as long as they do. It's the reason why when the decision leaked, the draft opinion, I should say, leaked, not necessarily the decision, but the draft opinion leaked on Dobbs, the draft opinion written by Alito, John Roberts said, look, this is not the final product, because it's not. I mean, it's even if it holds up as being the majority opinion, even if it's 5-4, 6-3, whatever it is, it's still going to be going through some more edits as they see what the dissenters have to say, so that each side can answer each other in the opinions. That's part of the courtesy and the interaction at the Supreme Court. But the reason why I'm going to be watching a little bit more closely today is I think that those intimidation campaigns are probably going to backfire. And I've actually been a little surprised, despite my normal embrace of
cynicism.
Yeah, my cynicism, yes, my cynicism about waiting for an hour before they go on airplanes to release that decision. Thank you, Dwayne. I think that they really are going to benefit by just ripping off the Band-Aid on this thing and getting it out as soon as possible. As soon as they have everything locked down in terms of the opinion, the dissent, the vote, etc. I mean, there's no reason to wait. No matter what they do, they're going to get a reaction. They're already getting it. And frankly, if I'm sitting on the Supreme Court right now watching all of this, even if maybe I'm not even in agreement with what Samuel Alito wrote, I'm probably getting a little angry over this and saying, this is nonsense. I mean, the best way to deal with this is to put it out. And that brings me to a really interesting essay that Josh Gerstein wrote over at Politico. He wrote this yesterday, and he was trying to figure out the contours of how John Roberts could maybe still pull off some sort of compromise decision where it saves Roe but upholds Dobbs. And look, I mean, we've been talking about that possibility for quite a long time. And is there a possibility? Sure, but I think that possibility probably evaporated once the Alito draft leaked, because I think at that point, any significant change in direction will look like the intimidation campaign succeeded. But I think that basically there's a stronger point to be made here, which is that Alito, if you read the draft carefully, Alito was saying this didn't belong in front of the Supreme Court in the first place. This is a matter for the legislatures to deal with. We should never have gotten involved in this. We've spent 50 years being the focal point of policy making, and that is not what the Supreme Court is about. And I think when you look at these intimidation campaigns, even if you're a justice maybe that's inclined to uphold Roe and uphold Casey and uphold Doe, by the way, which we don't talk about, but which is the basis for Casey, even if you're inclined to do that, you're probably looking around, maybe it's not outside your house, but you're looking outside of Amy Coney Barrett's house, Brett Kavanaugh's house, and realizing that Alito's right. That this is the product of arrogating legislative authority to the judiciary. Is what you get is public intimidation campaigns. You get basically what amounts to a lobbying campaign, and that's not appropriate for the federal judiciary. All of this is proving Alito's point, that this is not something that belonged in front of the Supreme Court in the first place. It was a historical anomaly that has never really been repeated in the same fashion and needs to be dispensed with, so this can go back to legislatures for a more rational public policy. And to get to the point on this, if you do something that ends up being a compromise where it salvages Roe, but it dispenses with Casey and maybe does something this way, that way, the other way with Doe, all you're doing is you're perpetuating the fact that It's not going to go to the legislatures. It's every single law is going to come to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court is going to be the ultimate arbiter of which law passes muster, which law doesn't pass muster, under this idea that there is this completely fallacious idea that the Constitution addresses abortion in any way, shape, or form, or even medical care in any way, shape, or form. And to do that means to perpetuate the issue that you've got right now. And the compromise that Josh outlines here is certainly a rational, perhaps a rational, possible outcome, but it solves nothing, and I think the justices understand that as well. When we come back, we'll talk a little bit more about this and even more about life. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh today from the ReliefFactor.com studios in Texas. And joining us now is David Drucker, senior political correspondent for the Washington Examiner, who has been covering the election in Alabama. You know, this is something, David, that I think that there's been a lot of attention paid to it, but I think that sometimes it just gets a little lost in the shuffle of everything that's happening in Washington. How important is this race in Alabama for Republicans' opportunities in the midterms?
Well, listen, I think it's fascinating because you have a Senate runoff with so many dynamics that represent what's going on in the party. I mean, Republicans are going to win the general election down here, no matter what. It's just that kind of state. But what we saw, and this was an early indication of some of the trends in Republican primaries we saw in the spring, and we saw it here first. We saw a candidate endorsed by former President Donald Trump who couldn't get it done. And it shows you that when you have a hardworking, dynamic candidate, in this case that was Katie Britt, that can overcome the Trump endorsement, as potent as it can be in some contests, and that's because, you know, what we've learned about the Trump endorsement is that it can take a candidate with talent and put him over the top in a tight contest, but it can't make something out of nothing. The other thing we've learned is that as much as Republican voters still like Donald Trump, and down here they still like him a lot, it doesn't mean they're going to take an endorsement in the form of marching orders. And even if the former president, had not withdrawn his endorsement of Brooks, Brooks was going to lose. Even if he had not endorsed Katie Britt in the runoff, she was going to win. And so it's a really good place to talk to Republicans about how they look at 22 and how they look at 24.
Well, I think that when you're looking at Katie Britt, too, I mean, this is another one of my data points here about looking forward rather than looking back. And I think that that's maybe something that plays against Donald Trump in his aspirations to return to the GOP nomination. I mean, Katie Britt is a fresh face, a fresh voice, somebody who is not just the next generation, but the generation after that. I mean, I was reading your article today, and she says time for the next generation to take over. Richard Shelby was, 87, 88 years old. Mo Brooks really was the next generation. Katie Britt is the generation after that.
He kind of got Generation X, you know,
yes.
Generation X, and we just couldn't seem to get past the baby boomers in any way, shape, or form. But, you know, there's still time. And, look, that's been a lot of the argument down here, is that Mo Brooks is 68 years old. He won't be in that long. They've had Richard Shelby, 88 years old. What they, you know, in some ways it's really interesting because they want to recreate the kind of seniority and influence that Richard Shelby had. And the way you do that is you get somebody in like Katie Britt, who's 40 years old, younger than me, and let her stay a while. And so they want, you know, a lot of Republicans in Alabama, they want you to go against the grain. They want some anti-establishment fervor, but they want you, once you get there, to use it within the system and not to tear down the system, because of the state with a lot of interests, military interests, agriculture interests. And so it's the sort of thing where, and we've seen this pattern. Maybe maybe you're not Trump's favorite, but if you don't fight against him, if you support his agenda and you talk about pushing it forward and not looking backward, that's something that works for them. And we saw it work for Brian Kemp in Georgia. We saw it work in a number of contests where they didn't react to Trump opposing them by opposing him. And so voters looked at them and said, hey, there's nothing wrong with these people. They like Trump. And it's true. And Katie Britt, campaigned as a pro-Trump Republican. And so they thought to themselves, I don't need Mo Brooks because I've got exactly what Trump should like, and I get it in better packaging with more know-how and the likelihood that they'll get more things done than just, railing against the machine.
And David, we're speaking with David Drucker from the Washington Examiner. We maybe have about a minute left or so. How much is Katie Britt talking about the election of 2020? And I think
she
this is a
talk
key.
About it
exactly.
At all.
Exactly. This is a big key, I think, for the midterms and for 2024.
Well, I think it's something that the former president's going to have to figure out if he launches a formal campaign for 2024. He is talking about the last election, and I've interviewed him about this. He insists that this is what Republican voters want to hear, and that if you don't address this issue, then you lose them on every other issue. But we just haven't seen that to be the case. The candidates that do the best talk about their support for what Trump did during his term in office, for wanting to do that themselves if they get elected, but focusing on all the problems and priorities that they have today and tomorrow. And it's an old axiom in politics. Candidates that look backward tend to lose. It sounds simple, but in many ways it is that simple. And Trump undercuts a lot of his own best qualities as a candidate and a politician when he spends so much time focusing on 20.
Right. David Drucker, Washington Examiner, it's exactly correct. Voters are focused on their future, not on the candidate's past. David M. Drucker on Twitter, at David M. Drucker on Twitter. Be sure to follow him. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com. Stay tuned. Thank you, Hugh Hewitt. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, filling in for Hugh today from the ReliefFactor.com studios in Texas. And we're having a great time here. And to help us figure out what's going on in Washington, D.C., we have Byron York, the chief political correspondent for the Washington Examiner, whose column yesterday, he's got a daily memo. You should be reading this every day anyway, but whose column yesterday says, of course, Biden is too old to be president. Byron, this used to be something that people would shush conservatives about up until very recently. What's changed?
Well, it has been actually very interesting. All of a sudden, it is okay if you were a Democrat to express concerns about Joe Biden's age. And used to be a very, very bad thing. And what we've seen, we saw an article in the New York Times that described a lot of Democrats who are nervous about the president for reasons that are obvious. I mean, if you watch the president, he's clearly slowed down. And he's going to be 80 on November 20th. And this is the world's toughest, most demanding, physically challenging job. So, Democrats with midterms coming very soon, which will then turn everybody's attention to a presidential election, are very worried because President Biden will be 82 when he finishes his first term, and if he runs again, he would be asking to serve until 86. This is completely unprecedented in American politics. Ronald Reagan was 77 when he left office, and his second term had been filled with speculation that he was senile. Today we would say speculation about his cognitive abilities,
right.
But there was tons of talk in Reagan's second term about him being, let's just say, too old to be president. So Democrats have finally just awakened to this, and there have been enough who were around the president who have said privately that they're concerned about it. And finally, it got into the news.
Well, it cuts both ways, and you make this point also in the column, is that the presumed front runner for the Republicans is Donald Trump, who wants to run again for a non-consecutive second term. He'll be 78 when that election rolls around, the same age that Biden was when just before he got elected, or just after he got elected, and asking us to rely on his cognitive abilities until the age of 82. Now, I'd say that before Biden's performance over the last 17 months, there may have been Republicans who wouldn't have been uncomfortable with that. I think, though, now that maybe not just Republicans, but Americans in general might be really reconsidering the whole electing septuagenarians to the White House idea even though 70 is clearly not the same thing as 70 40 years ago, it's still 70, and it's an issue, and we're seeing that issue now play out in how Joe Biden's handling his press conferences, handling extemporaneous questions, and especially the fact that they're hiding him from one-on-one interviews, and they have been for months now.
Yeah. Well, you were mentioning 70. 70 is kind of the new 60 in politics. It's 80 that is becoming the great concern. And I should say a few things. I don't know if you watched Trump's speech in Nashville at the Faith and Freedom Coalition thing. It was long, about an hour and a half. Incredibly energetic, high energy, high velocity the whole time, and that's very characteristic of his public performances. So there's no way that Biden could have pulled off something like that. Trump just turned 76 last week. If he ran again, and of course if he won, he could only serve one term. If he ran again, he would be president, and he won. He would be president between the ages of 78 and 82, which is precisely Biden's age during this first term. Now you ask yourself, well, gee, Trump seems to be in a lot better shape than Biden. What's the problem? Well, the problem is it's a gamble once you get past age 80, a gamble for the voters. Now, Trump's father lived to age 93. And you may have read, there was a horrendous fight over his will when he died, and it became clear that he had begun suffering cognitive difficulties, dementia, in about his mid-80s. So the thing is, time is coming for us all, and that includes Donald Trump. And so I, in the 2020 election, said, I thought that Joe Biden was just too old to be president, and this was no surprise. We've known his birthday for many years. He's just too old to be president. And I think that would probably have to apply for Trump running at the same age in 2024.
And I think we're reaching a point here, too, where the massive weight of the electorate is clearly a lot younger now than these front runners, and not just Biden and Trump.
Well, more than half the population was born since 1980. You have to explain to them what happened before then. Right.
So you're getting more and more of a disconnect, at least a cultural disconnect, between voters and Biden, and voters and Trump, for that matter, as well. But if you take a look at the Democratic side, and we've talked about this plenty, their perceived bench is almost the same age. You've got Elizabeth Warren, supposedly Bernie Sanders, even Hillary Clinton, who went out of her way this week last week to tell everyone, I'm not running. By the way, I'm not running. Just to let you know, as an update, I'm not running. They're all in their 70s.
Well, I don't have an answer to what I'm about to say, but I think we need to kind of grapple with the idea that we seem to have settled into a gerontocracy right now. The president's going to be 80 this November. The leader of the Republican Party, not someone in office, is Donald Trump, is now 76. The leader of the Republican Party in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, I think just turned 80. The Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, is 81. And then her two deputies, Steny Hoyer and James Clyburn, I think, are 82. What's going on here? It's really very strange that a younger generation of leaders has not taken over. And I think what we might see, we're going to have turmoil. Because of the age issue, we're going to have turmoil in both parties. Because apparently, just reports, Biden hasn't told me this, but Biden has kind of become convinced that he is the only person who can stop Donald Trump. And Donald Trump is the greatest threat to our republic, so he is the only man standing between us and the Trumpian abyss. And if he comes to sort of believe that, then he's going to want to run again to save the country. And a number of Democrats are going to disagree. And so the age issue is going to play out. And it's also going to play out in the Republican Party. Look at the people who are running for president or thinking about running for president. They're in their 40s and their 50s, and in some cases in their 60s. They're in the sweet spot of age for running for president. So if you had a Ron DeSantis who's, 44, 45, somewhere in there.
Something like that, yeah.
Versus Donald Trump, who would turn 82 at the end of his term. I mean, age will be an issue.
Well, and again, I think that we were just talking to your colleague David Drucker, who's watching the Alabama race, which I think is a microcosm of this. You've got Mo Brooks, who's 68, who's been around forever down there in Alabama. He's not in the 70s, but he's getting up there. And again, in the Senate, age isn't nearly as much of an issue as we know from the people who are currently populating the Senate.
Cohort.
He might indeed, yes. But and then you got Katie Britt, who's 40 years old, who's running as not somebody who's unconnected because she worked for Shelby, but somebody who's a fresh voice. That to me is a microcosm of what we're looking at. This electorate is going to want to look to the future, not to its past. And got about 30 seconds. I'll let you respond to that.
No, I heard David say that, and a part of that is a reaction to the departure of Shelby, who is over 80. And it just gives voters a feeling that they need to make a change. And I think you could certainly see that happen when you have a President Biden who's 82 years old, the country just making a change. In 1961, there was a handover between Dwight Eisenhower, who was then 70, the oldest president ever, to 43-year-old John F. Kennedy. You could see something like that happening this time.
Byron York from the Washington Examiner, at Byron York on Twitter. Be sure to be following him and reading him every single day. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com. We'll be right back. It's taken this long to get to the Bee Gees. Wow. I love the Bee Gees, guys. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, coming to you live from the ReliefFactor.com studios in Texas, where we have disco playing while Hugh's away. So there you go. And joining me right now, a fellow fan of disco. That's not true. Cam Edwards, BearingArms.com. Managing editor. I'm actually not clear as to what your position is on disco, Cam, but I'm assuming I'm about to hear it.
Disco. I am pro-disco.
Pro-disco!
I'll be the Robin to your Maurice. That's fine. We can do that.
Pro disco. See, the disco revival starts right here on the Hugh Hewitt Show. Cam Edwards, though, BearingArms.com is focused like a laser on Second Amendment issues. If you need any information at all on Second Amendment issues, you go to BearingArms.com. And Cam, I know that you're focused like a laser on what's going on in Washington, D.C. with the John Cornyn, Chris Murphy negotiations. It looked like those were getting derailed, and all of a sudden it looks like it's game on again. And this package that's being negotiated in the wake of the shootings in Uvalde and elsewhere appears to be back on track. What's your read on what's going on right now with these negotiations?
Yeah, we'll see. I mean, there was a flurry of headlines yesterday afternoon. A deal imminent, text imminent, didn't happen yesterday, as far as we know. Right? No text of the legislation was announced. So, my impression is that both sides really do want to get something done. Today is probably the day that they've got to release a legislative bill if, in fact, they're going to hold a vote this week. So was that leak yesterday talking about, how a draft is imminent? Who leaked that, right? Who put that out there that, okay, this is coming, everybody stay tuned? Because it didn't happen. And so to me, that seemed like maybe another attempt to try to goose these negotiations along a little bit. From what it seems like, and from what it sounds like, it seems like the Democrats have been willing to back away from virtually all of their demands in order to be able to pass something that they can call a win, right? And they can say, look, it's the first time in 30 years we've passed a gun control bill. As long as they get to say that, it seems like they're pretty flexible on what's actually in the actual legislation. But I am taking very much a wait-and-see approach here. And I'm not going to believe anything that the politicians say until I can actually take a look at every line of that text.
Well, that's because you are a careful man, Cam Edwards, and you've been down this road before, and you and I have talked about this. We do our VIP Gold chat for Hot Air and Bearing Arms on Wednesdays. We'll do this again tomorrow, in fact, tomorrow afternoon at 1:30 Eastern Time. And we've been talking a lot about this particular package. The people who are in our VIP Gold programs have been very interested in this, and I know that you've expressed some skepticism about the elements of this package, and I think primarily about the red flag law subsidies, if you will, how that's going to be structured, and how these red flag laws are even going to work, because they can be and have been in the past abused to basically be gun grabbing levers, if you will, for courts and for law enforcement. How worried are you about what you've seen so far on the red flag laws?
Well, I'm actually a little less worried than I was this time last week, because, again, what we've been hearing is that states that don't want to adopt red flag laws don't have to, and can still have access to federal funds if they've got other crisis intervention programs in place. That would be good if that's actually in the final package. But as you say, I mean, I have my concerns about red flag laws fundamentally, because I think that my big issue with red flag laws is that, okay, here is somebody who the court says is dangerous. We're going to take their guns away. We're going to leave them alone. Right? There's no mental health treatment. There's nothing, no sort of electronic monitoring. It's basically just like, okay, once we've taken the guns, we think the problem has been solved. Well, that's not the case when you're dealing with dangerous individuals. So to me, a red flag law is a gun control solution to a mental health problem. And so I would be glad to see some flexibility put into this bill that would allow states access to federal funds if they didn't want to impose red flag laws. But I'll tell you the thing I'm really getting concerned about here, Ed, is that they're talking about holding a vote this week. We still don't have legislative text. I am very concerned the Democrats are going to try to sneak something in to this legislation, kind of bury it in there, which is why I think people are going to need to go over this, whatever package this is, with a fine-tooth comb. Make sure there are no poison pill amendments. Make sure that there's nothing hidden away in there that all of a sudden goes beyond the parameters of the deal or goes against what we've been hearing is going to contain within this framework.
It's interesting, too, because John Cornyn went back to Houston for the Republican convention down there and did not get a very cheery reception. He says that's not going to bother him. He's not going to get pushed out of the lane here. He wants to keep pursuing this. Overall, what I would say is theoretically, or in a vacuum, the elements of that are being brooded about as part of this package tend to be popular with voters, and the least popular one, which was the assault weapons ban, was dropped early. So they're not even discussing weapons restrictions or anything else like that in that sense. But I think you're right when it comes down to the details. Some of these might turn out to be a lot less popular, and of course you've always got the issue, Cam, of the laws of unintended consequences, which is when you write even if it's not a poison pill, even if it's not sneaking one past the goalie for malicious purposes, legislation just creates odd incentives on its own, and that's the reason why you have to take real care with the legislative language.
Absolutely, and red flag laws, I think, are a perfect example of this, right? The idea is, okay, we're going to have this in place, and now there'll be a mechanism so we can deal with dangerous people. I got to tell you, I've talked with several Second Amendment activists from across the country over the last 3 or 4 weeks, and they've told me that they're really concerned, and several of them live in states where red flag laws are already in place. In fact, I was talking to somebody in Connecticut where they're kind of expanding who can report someone and initiate a red flag process, and they're really, really concerned about the effect that this is going to have on people who are seeking mental health treatment, not because they are, planning a mass murder, but because maybe they're going through a divorce. Maybe they've lost a child, but, they're going through something in their life where they feel like they want to reach out to a counselor. And now they're deathly afraid that this counselor isn't going to understand gun owners. And as soon as this counselor understands, okay, this person is a gun owner in front of me, well, we better take their guns away because I think that they're, in a dangerous position in their life. And so they're concerned that we're actually going to see less access to mental health. We're going to see people who could use a counselor deciding not to because they're afraid of the potential of a red flag law being falsely imposed on them.
Well, and to be fair, right? I mean, it may not even be that you're talking with a counselor who has a particular animus towards owning firearms. You may be just talking to a counselor who has a particular animus towards, a lawsuit in case something does happen. I mean, the threat of litigation over something like that would probably be fairly strong and certainly a huge incentive to invoke a red flag law just to be on the safe side. Not necessarily the safe side for everybody involved, but for your own fiscal safe side if you're a counselor who's dealing with an issue like this, even if it approaches the line. These are and this is what I mean about unintended consequences and perverse incentives. When you're setting these types of things up, you have to game out all of those things to find out how you're going to limit the damage from whatever changes that you're making. And that is a huge one, I think, when you're dealing with red flag laws.
I do too. You can also look at the fact that in states that have these ex parte hearings, basically, the quote unquote temporary order, and then you go back a couple of weeks later and both sides actually get to participate. In those initial hearings, in New Jersey, for example, about 90% of those petitions are approved. But the final hearing, where the subject of the petition actually gets to be in court and provide their side of the story, only about 50% of those final orders are approved. And that concerns me too, Ed, because it seems to me like that's a sign that judges are rubber stamping at least the initial petition, right? As you say, there is this incentive. I don't want to be the judge that let this person keep their guns and they went and did something wrong, so better safe than sorry. We'll sort it out in a couple of weeks. That still, I think is a big issue because it means that, in essence, once the petition has been filed, your guns are going away for a couple of weeks anyway, right? Maybe you'll be allowed to get them back at that final hearing, but I'm just not convinced that red flag laws are actually a meaningful and substantive approach to dealing with dangerous people who are ready to do dangerous things.
We're speaking with Cam Edwards of BearingArms.com. I want to ask you about the ATF director nomination confirmation. Steve Dettelbach, I believe it's Steve Dettelbach, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Steve Dettelbach has been nominated and came out of committee on a tie vote. Do you know where we're at on that? Have we heard what the whip count's going to be on this? Is this going to be a 50 vote plus Kamala Harris success for Joe Biden, or do we see any signs that Joe Manchin or another Democrat might decide that Dettelbach is just not the right guy for ATF?
No, Manchin has said he's on board. Angus King has said he's on board. So I think they've got the Democratic caucus. And I think that Dettelbach is going to get confirmed even if Kamala Harris has to pass the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. It could be that, there are a couple of other Republicans, maybe some of the Republicans who are part of these negotiations. I would not be surprised to see a Mitt Romney or a Susan Collins sign on as well and give Dettelbach a little bit of bipartisan cover. I do think that the shootings in Buffalo and Uvalde really did impact Dettelbach's confirmation chances. I think that after that occurred, Manchin and Angus King were like, all right, he's acceptable to us. The problem with Dettelbach, from my perspective, is that while David Chipman, who was the first nominee to head up the ATF, was a gun control lobbyist, Dettelbach's an anti-gun politician, right? They have the same ideology, they just have different backgrounds.
Well, that's something to keep an eye on, and Cam Edwards at BearingArms.com is keeping an eye on it. He's on Twitter at Cam Edwards, if you want to follow him there. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I'm Ed Morrissey of HotAir.com, coming to you live from the ReliefFactor.com studios in Texas, where we're trying to pick up the pieces of a rational energy policy, which have fallen apart for the last 18 months. Joining us to discuss this is Mike Summers, President and CEO of the American Petroleum Institute. They're at API.org. And Mike, I've been looking forward to talking with you to get at least some response to Joe Biden's continuous claims about record profits and corporate greed and that being the cause of high gas prices and inflation today. I mean, just a whole series of nonsense over the last couple of weeks, and I'm sure that you've had a few choice words to say about some of that.
Ed, great to be with you this morning. I'm a longtime listener, but first-time caller, so it's a real pleasure to be with you today. But you're right. This has been quite the whirlwind. We started this administration with them canceling the Keystone XL pipeline, delaying permits and leases on federal lands. They proposed new taxes on the oil and gas industry. It was just this endless stream of efforts to really diminish what is, in my view, the most important industry in the world, the American oil and gas industry. Really the engine of the world economy. And by the way, it's also the industry that pulled us out of the 2008 financial crisis because of the fracking revolution that started right there in Texas. So it really was a tragedy, that first year of this administration, what they did to really diminish this homegrown American industry. And, over the course of the last few months, what we've seen is the consequence of those policy decisions. And so what they're trying to do now is trying to put Humpty Dumpty back together again. But the truth of the matter is that these are long-term investments. And it took a long time to put us in this position that we're in today. And it's going to take us some time to get out of it. But really what it's going to require is some real policy changes from the Biden administration.
Right. I mean, and again, I mean, we can just look at the inflection of gas prices, which weren't going up at all over the last few years prior to Biden issuing EO 13990 and implementing a lot of these policies. By the way, I should ask you, how big of an obstacle has EO 13990, the executive order that Biden signed on his first day in office, imposing all sorts of different restrictions on the oil and natural gas industry? How big of an obstacle has that been in reality?
So I think the biggest consequence of what they put into place on day one is really a lack of investment within the industry itself. And that's been the biggest challenge, is that to even provide for what we expect to be future demand, this industry requires billions of dollars of investment every single year. So when you have an administration that is continuously putting pressure on an industry and saying that we're not going to be using oil and gas, by 2030, you're not going to get the investment that you need, either from the companies themselves or from Wall Street. And so this administration, the biggest effect that they've had is really been a focus on divestment from the oil and gas industry. And the consequence of that is going to be tremendous over the course of the next few years. Even if this administration goes away 2 years from now, the consequences of what they put into place today is going to have ramifications for decades and decades to come.
Well, of course it is, and so will the rhetoric that's coming out of the White House, because it's making it very clear that they are hostile to expansion of oil and natural gas projects. I mean, he's been saying that not just since day one, but almost since day one of his presidential campaign, that he was going to shut down drilling, he was going to shut down fossil fuels. They were going to have this incredible transition, which was the phrase he used a month ago, to a new renewables future. And if you're hearing that and you're a capital investor, you're not going to be terribly excited about sinking a lot of money into a 5 or 10 year project that won't start to pay off until actually the end of the project. And that's one of the big issues, I think, that the oil industry is facing. And not just ExxonMobil, not just Chevron. The oil industry is actually a whole lot of smaller companies as well who really need capital investors and who aren't finding them.
Yeah, and you think about the fact that this industry employs about 11 million people in the United States. It is about 8% of America's GDP. I like to call it the first 8%, because the rest of the economy can't thrive unless this industry is able to thrive.
That's right.
And this economy has really benefited from affordable, reliable, and inexpensive fuel sources for over a decade. And if we want to get this economy back moving again, we need to get back to the policies that got us there.
We're going to get to what Mike Summers from American Petroleum Institute and what API are proposing for that. They have a 10-point plan, because a lot of times people will challenge me, what's your plan? What's your plan? Well, I mean, I already know what my plan is. I've been writing about it since 2008. You need to incentivize an expansion of exploration and extraction. You need to expand refinery capacity. You need to structure this in a way so that long-term investors don't get scared off by election cycles, and you need to make sure that we are self-sufficient when it comes to energy. That doesn't mean just oil and natural gas, by the way, but it certainly has to include it. API has some thoughts on that. We're going to get to that in just a second. Mike, I want to just address a couple of points that Biden has been making over the last couple of weeks. You know, the idea that ExxonMobil doesn't pay taxes, the idea that refiners are price gouging, and that's the reason why prices are so high. You know, I did something that apparently no reporter thought to do in the United States, which was I went online, I took a look at the quarterly reports from ExxonMobil. I looked at the quarterly reports from Chevron, from Marathon, and BP, and Citgo, which is not really, you know, all you get is just the refining stuff from Citgo because that's Venezuelan.
That's right.
Venezuelan firm, a sovereign firm from Venezuela. But you know what I found is that, you know, ExxonMobil's profit margin in the first quarter was 6%. Now, that's not bad, but I mean, it's not gangbusters either for investors. And their tax rate was 32%. Then I looked at Goldman Sachs, which is where people really make the money in America. That's
right.
Goldman Sachs had a net profit margin in the first quarter of 30.5%, and I think their effective tax rate was something around 15%. So I guess there's corporate greed going on here, but I don't necessarily think it's coming from the oil industry. And I'm just kidding because, I mean, Goldman Sachs makes money doing what Goldman Sachs makes money doing. And people, that's a
right.
it's voluntary. So people don't have to go to Goldman Sachs. But
well, don't you find it curious that no one is proposing a windfall profits tax on Goldman Sachs or Apple or Amazon, who have made billions of dollars more than the oil industry? You mentioned ExxonMobil, one of my biggest members. ExxonMobil lost $20 billion in 2020 as a consequence of the demand destruction that occurred because of the global pandemic. When everyone stopped going to work, stopped going to school, Western economies basically shut down. That demand destruction led to a significant decline in company profits. So no one was talking about, we weren't asking for a government bailout at that point. That certainly wasn't the case of other industries. But I do think you have to put some of these profits in perspective when you're looking at it. And as we discussed, we need policies that actually advance American energy independence and American energy security, and that's not what we're getting today.
So let's talk about that. API.org has a 10-point plan up. You can go over and read it yourself. API.org. Just go to API unveils 10-point policy plan to restore U.S. energy leadership, fuel economic recovery. Obviously, we're not going to be able to go into all 10 points in depth. But tell me, I mean, I gave you my 3-point plan, my three-ish point plan, right? I'm assuming that you agree with those. With those 3 points are represented in this. What else do we need to do?
Yeah, so you talked about some of them. First of all, we need to reverse a number of these Biden proposals from getting pipeline infrastructure back up and going. That Keystone decision was really the industry itself. There are hundreds of thousands of miles of pipelines already in this country, but that requires continually updating that infrastructure so that we can get the product from where it is to where it needs to be. And what you've seen under this administration are continued regulatory delays on infrastructure development. Keystone was just the tip of the iceberg. It has continued throughout this administration with new regulatory requirements from the administration itself and from the federal agency that regulates this. So we need to reverse those decisions. You could do that with the stroke of a pen. But Congress also needs to get involved here as well. We need to open up our federal lands and waters to more development. The administration, for example, has not put into place a new 5-year plan for leasing in the Gulf of Mexico. The Gulf of Mexico accounts for about 15% of America's oil production today. Without the 5-year plan, which is required by law, we can't develop any more of the Gulf of Mexico. They were supposed to have that done by June 30th, and instead they're starting the process on June 30th. That means no lease sales in the Gulf of Mexico after June 30th. An absolute disaster for the Gulf. And by the way, for those who are concerned about environmental performance, as we are, those are the lowest carbon-intensive barrels that we produce in the United States. We should be investing more in the Gulf of Mexico. There are a couple of other things they can do. For example, the SEC just proposed a disastrous new climate disclosure regime, not just on our industry, but on every industry. And trade associations like API are stepping up to fight that SEC climate disclosure regime. That needs to be reversed immediately, because what that does is it's going to diminish investment in our great industry, which we've already talked about. It requires billions of dollars of investment every single year. So these are just a couple of the different ideas that we've put forth in the API 10 for 22 plan, which, again, as you mentioned, you can find at api.org.
Mike Summers, President and CEO of American Petroleum Institute, thank you so much for being with us. Again, go to api.org. You can find that 10-point plan. It's a common sense energy plan. That's what's missing in America right now. I'm Ed Morrissey of hotair.com. We'll be right back.